you have to be so careful if you're going to write a story about a group of international terrorists attacking America.
Yeah.
Because when you're designing these characters and you're designing their ideology and what they're doing, it's so fraught. You're dealing with some very real-world, heavy political things. And every time you design a character who hates a particular thing about America, if that character you've designed is an out-and-out villain that the entire book you're going to be rooting against, you have positioned the plot in such a way and yourself in such a way that you are defending the thing that that character doesn't like about America. And he had a bunch of different characters dislike different things about America, and it started to feel like everything they disliked was something that the author was saying is good, right? It's like, shouldn't be a problem, and like for people to hold it against America is wrong. Welcome, friends, to episode 252 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Walter Wager's 1987 novel, 58 Minutes, which would be the basis for Die Hard 2, in case you don't know. I feel like it's good to get that out there, because people see 58 minutes, like, what the fuck is that?
Yeah, I mean, on Audible, they have it listed now.
It's on the cover.
Yeah, very apparent that that's the case.
I'm surprised that Roderick Thorpe didn't get this treatment a little more, right? Like, for whatever reason, this book it seems like it got a little more of a push in marketing and connecting it to the franchise than Nothing Lasts Forever, which seems to be largely forgotten, was very hard to find. It's like semi out of print. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why these decisions get made. Maybe it's like the teams on behalf of each author and how much they're pushing for it and what they can get. That's probably what it comes down to.
Probably, yeah.
Maybe Wager's got a better agent or a more active agent.
Or I don't know, maybe the artist wants it to stand alone as its own thing. And
I think Thorpe and Wager are both deceased now, so whatever's left is now just like legacy stuff. Maybe could be estate, maybe. You know, their relatives overseeing some of this stuff. 58 minutes. I mean, it made a sale. I bought it on Audible, so somebody should still be making money off of it. Maybe it's the children. Anyway, Die Hard 2. We decided to go back to the world of John McClane and Die Hard. We started off our entire show. Our very first Christmas project was Die Hard, and that's a perennial classic to me. My relationship with it has definitely like shifted over time, but I still enjoy that movie. It still feels like Christmas to me when it's on. We talked about how to both of us, we feel it is a Christmas movie. But I mean, at this point, the debate over it is kind of silly and it's gotten overdone to death.
Yeah.
So
I think in 2017 it was already kind of a topic that had been well tread, and now it's been, like 5 years.
Yeah, they keep trotting it out every year. So we're like, why not look at Die Hard 2, also set around Christmas, and ask the question, is this a Christmas movie? And also, is it a decent movie? Is the adaptation any good? How does the two compare? So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to get into here. But yeah, happy holidays, man.
Happy holidays to you and our listeners.
Yeah, and to the listeners. We celebrate Christmas. I celebrate it in a way that is basically a-religious. Almost more like a Yuletide,
Very pagan. I'm very pagan.
I haven't gone through the process of like stripping all of my Christmas decorations from their, Christ connected imagery. I'm too lazy to do that. So it looks pretty similar. I don't have a lot of crosses or anything like that. So that's like my one way of doing it, kind of pagan. But maybe I should get more into the pagan version of it, right?
Very Green Knight.
That could be cool. Maybe one of these days, maybe I'll start transitioning to that. But regardless, it's a holiday I like.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoy the sort of like cozy, twinkling lights this time of year when it's cold out. And getting together with family usually, although this year I can't go to Florida, unfortunately. I am not able to take to the skies like the people in this novel. So it's nice to be able to revisit a franchise that I have a lot of fondness for. Have you seen Die Hard 2, James.
Yeah, but completely erased from my memory. So,
Okay.
if it's even similar to this book, I don't remember.
Okay. I have seen it a few times, but the most recent time it's probably 15 plus years ago. So I have some vague memories of it, but yeah, honestly, I couldn't tell you a lot about it. Some of it came back reading this book because there is some similarities. And this is kind of an interesting adaptation. And I guess we'll probably get more into the actual adaptation choices that were made once we've seen the movie and can talk about it more. But one of the things that is interesting to me just out of the gates is they decided to adapt Die Hard 2 from this book, but they're basically just lifting the plot and some of the characters are similar, but like the main character is John McClane now. Right? And much like the first Nothing Lasts Forever book, they've taken an original character and put it in the protagonist position of a thriller novel that they are ostensibly adapting. I haven't seen this a ton in the other projects we've covered, right? Where it's like kind of an adaptation, but it's also just like we're going to use the plot from this thing and some characters and then otherwise make it our own thing.
Yeah, it is strange because to connect it to a franchise that was already going from a book that has nothing to do with it.
Right.
Really, the only thing it has going for it is that it somewhat fits in that thriller genre with a lot of the same tropes that you're expecting to see in a Die Hard film.
So interestingly, this book came out in 1987. Die Hard 1 comes out in 1988. So this book was actually released and published before the original Die Hard came out.
Yeah. Let's talk about this genre. I don't know the name. Very well-known author has these kinds of military-esque sort of cop, whatever, action kind of thriller stories.
There's a bunch of them out there. Like the guy does the Jack Reacher series.
They're always on the shelves that when you go into like a big bookstore. Like,
well, we've covered Tom Clancy, although his are more military.
Yeah, this does kind of feel like Hunt for Red October kind of.
Oh yeah, this totally could be a Tom Clancy novel. So yeah, I think you're talking about these like military thrillers, these espionage thrillers,
cop thrillers,
crime thrillers. Yeah, it's more like when I say crime thriller, I think more about like criminals being protagonists, whereas this is not that. This is much more like
because that makes me think like noir, which this is not really.
That.
I mean, maybe there's some seeds from noir, but it's kind of evolved.
I think Tom Clancy is a good comp, honestly. Like as far as like somebody who's a lot more popular, but. If you're wanting to get an idea of like what is this book even like, it's kind of like a Tom Clancy novel.
And not to sort of dissuade people from liking this or anything like that, but I've really come to grips with the fact that this is not my genre of choice.
Okay, so I mean, that's a good opening. I wanted to ask you. You've seen the movie maybe, but don't remember it. So you're going into this book fairly blind, not really knowing what to expect. And yeah, it sounds like it wasn't quite landing with you. What was the disconnect there?
I just it's hard for me to get invested and have my interest piqued in a story that feels so cliche in ways. And I know that maybe it wasn't for the time period, but now it feels that it is.
It might have been still even then.
And a lot of the characters are super one-dimensional and. Like, I rolled my eyes really hard when our main character was introduced as this, like, Harvard grad turned Vietnam veteran, football playing, like, Harvard, superstar.
He's a star quarterback, Harvard football lawyer who decided he didn't want to be a lawyer and instead be a cop, and he got divorced because his wife didn't understand, but he's, like, super devoted to the job, and he looks like a quarterback, and he's tall and blonde and handsome and capable and the best shot on the the entire squad. Yeah. And he can kill people, but he decides not to because he's a good dude.
Which at the end of the day, look, if you want that sort of wish fulfillment and you want to travel along with a character, like that's great. But for me, I found it to be very shallow.
Yeah, we're talking about Police Captain Frank Malone, who is our main character here, who will be changed into John McClane. And this character is the worst part of the book. And there are a lot of other things I didn't like about the book, just to get it out from the gates. But like, he is so boring. Like, fuck this guy. He's so boring. He is a obviously he is like this wish fulfillment. You know, talk about like Mary Jane characters, or what is it? What is that? Is that the term?
It's Mary Sue.
Thank you, Mary Sue. Yeah. I don't like the term that much. I don't tend to use it. Regardless, that sort of like author insert or just wish fulfillment character who has no flaws, sometimes gets like too much of a bad rap, because I think even if a character has no real flaws, as long as they are still interesting, like if they're still engaging, they have a personality that you want to spend time with, that there's something about them that's compelling, then you can make that kind of a character work. And like maybe it won't ever be like the greatest of fiction as far as like presenting the nuances of a human condition, because this character is kind of too good for that. You could still have a fun story. But this is not that to me. This is a character who has been made so perfect, and any sort of flaw has been taken away from the character, that all you're left with is the most boring G.I. Joe character that is so forgettable.
Yeah.
And I can see why someone would look at it and go like, this plot is interesting. What if we put a character in who actually has flaws and is actually an interesting person?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden maybe it makes it for a decent story.
Luke Skywalker is started out often as this kind of character, but
right.
I think the world building and some of the intrigue of the character and his connection to
Luke isn't, hyper capable right out of the gates. He at least has to learn,
sure.
Right? Like there's at least an arc. Frank Malone, he is the same throughout. He never changes. Nothing phases him. Like he is hyper capable, super connected, brilliant, deadly, but generous. All these things that all come together and to make just a person that doesn't exist. And even if they did exist, would kind of be a boring person to be around, probably.
And I mean, to compare this character to John McClane, because that's sort of where we're going to be at.
Yeah.
John McClane in the first Die Hard is, stumbling and bumbling through it and making it work and stepping on glass, and there's a lot of character there.
He's not someone who went to Harvard and studied law and then decided to become a cop because he just had a passion for it. No, he's blue collar. His personal life's a mess. Not because his wife doesn't understand that he wanted to be a cop, but because he's kind of an asshole and he rubs people the wrong way, and he is famous for doing that. Like,
well, don't get me. This guy also rubs me the wrong way. Just like there's some ideology things when.
Well, sure.
He'll think about different races, or he'll think of...
I think that is more the narration, because it's consistent with every character, I would say. Like, it's...
That is true,
That's maybe like my next topic I want to get into, is sort of the ideologies behind this book that rub me the wrong way. But, Frank Malone is just boring. Like, give him some vices, give him some uncertainty about something, like have him have doubts about anything,
and that takes away the stakes a lot too, right? Like you know how everything's gonna go all along, and everything he does, he makes the perfect shot at the perfect moment. He makes the correct call by calling in some specialized jet that he knew about, some military secret.
Right, he knows everybody. He can get the president involved in shit. Like he's not on the ground being disrespected by people who outrank him, which is often what happens to John McClane, right? Like, oh, you're just a regular cop. We're, FBI, we're whatever, right? No respect. Whereas everybody respects him. They're like, oh, Frank Malone, he's not just a cop. He's super well decorated, and we all know about him. Anyway, I just think he's a bad character. And so talking about the genre, right? Like the thriller military genre. I feel like this is inherently going to be a conservative leaning, if not fully conservative, kind of right-wing genre. But I'm open to the idea, and actually I would love to hear from people if you know some sort of military thrillers, or they don't have to be military, but just like...
I mean, there are absolutely some action-oriented like military thrillers that lean further left than something like this.
I would assume there has to be, right? Because it's a big space. But I'm just noticing that like these setups, you have to be so careful if you're going to write a story about a group of international terrorists attacking America.
Yeah. Because
when you're designing these characters and you're designing their ideology and what they're doing, it's so fraught. You're dealing with some very real-world, heavy political things. And every time you design a character who hates a particular thing about America, if that character you've designed is an out-and-out villain that the entire book you're going to be rooting against, you have positioned the plot in such a way and yourself in such a way that you are defending the thing that character doesn't like about America. And he had a bunch of different characters dislike different things about America, and it started to feel like everything they disliked was something that the author was saying is good, right? It's like shouldn't be a problem, and like for people to hold it against America is wrong at the very least. And so it's this like tacit approval thing, and I don't know if that was what he meant.
Let's give an example of that. Can you give a specific?
Sure. So one that keeps coming up over and over again is these terrorists calling the Americans imperialists and attacking sort of their standing in the world, and then calling them racists. And also religion gets brought up a few times. It seems kind of like anti-Christian. Our main villains are either alternate religions to Christianity or often atheists. Like I think our main villain guy, number one, is an atheist, and he like hates religion and like hates that about America. And it's a lot of it's just like wanting to see America get taken down a peg. And you see a lot of people just calling them American imperialists. And that's one where I'm like, America's imperialism is kind of shitty. And it is something that we should think about critically. And our history of imperialism is not a good one. Not saying that we deserve, terrorist attacks, obviously. But, like, you have to be careful when you're motivating all your characters in a way because it feels like you're defending it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really interesting to think of this in terms of when it came out and what it's talking about with plane hijackings and knocking down, a lot of the stuff that's going on.
I mean, there was a line about how, like, America is so complacent, nothing has happened, we haven't been attacked.
They haven't been attacked for 100 years on their
This
soil.
guy basically wants to be Bin Laden. He's like, he wants to be the one, our main terrorist. He wants to be the one to, like, shake America to its core and cause a disaster.
And that's really all there is to it. And at the end of his plan, spoilers kind of, is that like there was no going back from what he set in motion. He ultimately wanted it all to turn into a fireball anyway, with no remorse and kind of just right off.
Well, he's a complete psychopath too. Like our opening chapters with him, it's established that he is a complete psychopath who doesn't care about anybody. And when you're tying all of the ideas that these people are purporting with these absolutely heinous people, I don't know, it's tough. And like we see a lot of other characters who are like misogynistic, racist, but they're doing it in the way of like, it's okay, nudge, nudge, no big deal, it's not hurting anybody. Oh, the stewardess doesn't care that the pilot's hitting on her, she laughs it off. It's like, it's all like that. And then when you hear the terrorists saying things like racist and like hating on America, it feels like such an overblown reaction to the innocuous stuff that we're seeing almost celebrated on the other side. And that was where it just got kind of gross for me, because it's like we're gonna make everything seem like it's no big deal, and so that way it seems like this hate for American society is completely misplaced, and everybody, all these terrorists are just complete psychopaths. And, it just reduces the story to a place where there's a clear good and evil, right? There's a clear good guys, bad guys, and there's no nuance there. And I think that's by design, because he knows his audience. I assume this is by design. The audience for this book, that's what they want. Like, I think if you're reading this book, you agree with that kind of political opinion. And he knows that, so he's like, people don't want to read a book and be challenged about their love for country, people who love this kind of book. So I don't think, Wager wanted to do that at all. I get why he chose that, and maybe he did fully believe all of this. I assume he probably did. But when it comes to me, from an outsider who doesn't read the genre as much, it wasn't very interesting. I wanted to see, like, these are real hot button differences in people's, outlooks on the world and countries' political leanings. And I would actually find it interesting to hear them presented in ways that isn't inherently condemning. You know what I mean? Like, every time he talked about another country's points of view on stuff, it felt like it was just like being inherently condemned or being shown to be foolish or barbaric in some way.
it's more real to life, right? Like, people are complex. There's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of overlap, and good versus evil. Like, as much as, some would want you to have that as like, oh, they're evil. No one's inherently evil, like, so they have children or that they love. And, there's all these other complexities that go into.
I mean, there are psychopaths out there and they do get involved in this stuff, but they might be a piece of a larger whole. And at least that larger whole is probably not 100% evil.
Yeah. So, in listening to this, I feel like people who love this would listen to us say all of this and say, like, shut up. That's not what I want to think about when I'm reading a story like this.
I understand that that's the genre, right?
And that's what it comes down to. And for me, I just found myself really, like you said, I was bored reading this at times, and it was a task to finish it. And it's not a very long book.
Yeah. And there's a lot that happens. It's fast paced. There's a lot of action. There's a lot of gunfights and military action being taken.
Let's talk about that too. The description that goes on in this genre of military equipment, guns and jets.
Very loving. It's almost fetishizing the technology, which also reminds me of Tom Clancy a little bit, like fetishizing the guns themselves and the people who use them. Often are
they talk about like, oh, this is this specific gun from West Germany, and now there was an interesting thing that he threaded into this with the main antagonist sort of disguising where he's from and trying to throw the scent off of like who he is and what his motives are by using different countries' weaponry and that kind of thing, which, that's an interesting wrinkle. But to me, just the way that it dives into that stuff, it wants you to be like, oh, cool, this experimental. And like, I find myself, and maybe this is something that I would have been more interested in when I was younger, but I find that to be so dull. Like and I'm a technical person. Like I like technology. I find myself really fascinated with a lot of camera technology and stuff that people would find completely boring. But this talk of just like, it's just this cool factor that you're supposed to get caught up in.
Well, it's whether or not he's doing it because he truly loves all this stuff and is fully bought in, or if he's just doing it because that's the expectation of the genre. Like, military thriller readers want that. They want to read about guns. They want to read about technology. And they want to read it about it in a way that it is like, isn't this fucking cool? Because that's what that's what a lot of people think. So I think that's what you're appealing to there. So one thing that kept rubbing me the wrong way, and I just have to point out right from the start, our main character, but then also just like, because there's a lot of head hopping in this book. It never really stays in one point of view. It's a lot of like, we'll be in a scene and we'll get this person's thoughts and we'll get another person's thoughts and we'll get a third person's thoughts.
I actually didn't hate that mode either, because I liked breaking away from some of the certain point of views I was not that invested in, and then we'd get this random snapshot of a scene from like on a plane that's been hijacked or something like that, where they're building up the tension, and like I actually liked that they had that many different viewpoints.
Yeah, well, I mean, and going from scene to scene, totally cool with that. Within a scene, so like going to the plane, you have both the point of view of the like nun woman, and then also the stewardess guy who's talking to her. What do they call him?
Flight attendant.
Flight attendant. There we go. Who's talking to her. You get his point of view at the same time. So you're bouncing back and forth. And that's really where I'm talking about head hopping. But that was more in the style. We're talking about 80s. Stephen King is somebody who we've read who continues to write like that. And he is obviously very good at what he does. It's something that's not in fashion these days. So I'll be curious to see if it ever like fully comes back. But to me, it seems like we've moved away from that.
Is it? Do you find it to be jarring? Do you find it to be what is it?
Yeah.
About it? Why is it falling out?
I think it can be a little unwieldy, and it's also just like it reminds you that you're in a book. It reminds you, it's a little bit of like that immersion thing, because in our own lives, we are in our own minds, and we get the idea of like, hey, we're gonna drop into another character's mind. But it feels like their perception should be limited by their reality. And so as you're starting to orient yourself inside someone else's mind and what they can perceive, all of a sudden you're lifted and dropped to the other side of the same conversation they're having with the other character and their thoughts. And that movement is very unnatural. Some people are fine with it, and like it doesn't bother me when done well, but just like that's not my natural go-to, because to me it does feel a little jarring, I guess, at times. But anyway, all of this I was trying to set up that multiple POVs do this. He loves to talk about a character and just reduce them to their nationality. and he says phrases. The guy on the other end of the line was a Latin. And then, and then there was a Japanese inside the room. He just uses their like nationality and he calls it like a Japanese, a Latin. It just like rubbed me the wrong way so much, and so many different characters do it. And it's of course it's only being used for like non-white people, reducing them in some way. And then also like the ways he describes women, he calls them buxom, and he calls them like all of these words are just so like misogynistic and oh man.
Well, and like we didn't even mention how much like all the women want this character as well. Obviously, our main character.
Of course, everybody wants him, and not even that. Like any other male character we're supposed to like is irresistible. Like there's this British guy on the plane whose assistant is 18 years younger than him and has secretly been in love with him like for all this time and like pining over him.
He's like about to retire. He's like 60. Yeah.
It's all just male fantasy. Your beautiful hot young assistant is in love with you, and like now that he's gotten divorced, she's like, ooh, maybe something will happen, but I don't know.
His ex-girlfriend is like a air traffic control sort of supervisor of some kind. Yeah, Frank's and our main character. And she is like, he's got a wedding ring on still, and she's like constantly thinking about like, oh, what is his wife gonna think if he knew? Like, I just love him so much, and I'm starting to feel it again, and all this stuff. But he's, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm thinking of these things, and I'm just like, God damn.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's male wish fulfillment.
You were talking before about how he was addressing people by their nationality, and I had the thought like it would be really funny if he just like picked up the phone and he's like, there was a white on the other line.
I think about how jarring that would be, right?
Yeah,
and that just shows like why is that jarring and not calling someone a Japanese? They're both. It would be terrible, and that just kind of shows how awful it is. And that doesn't even take into account like historic, situations of oppression. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about Walter Wager before we get into the plot of the book. Walter Herman Wager was born in 1924, would die in 2004. He was an American crime and espionage thriller novelist and former editor-in-chief of Playbill magazine. The movie Teflon, starring Charles Bronson, was inspired by his novel of the same name. His book 58 Minutes was adapted into Die Hard 2, starring Bruce Willis, which is why we're talking about him today. So he was born in the Bronx, New York City. He's the son of a doctor and a nurse who immigrated from the Russian Empire. In 1944, he graduated from Columbia College. He went on to a Harvard Law School degree 3 years later. Passing the bar exams, but choosing not to practice, he went on to receive a master's degree in aviation law from Northwestern University in 1949, while also serving as an editor for the Journal of Air Law and Commerce, and then based in that city. Afterward, he spent a year in Paris as a Fulbright Fellow. He spent a year in Israel as an aviation law consultant to the Israeli Department of Civil Aviation, helping to negotiate a treaty on airspace, and working out of the Lida Airport in Tel Aviv. In 1952, he returned to New York City, where he worked for the United Nations, editing documents. So, I mean, this guy, like, you could see that self-insert a little bit, right? Like, there's a little bit of that, like...
You got to write what you know.
Yeah, like, Frank Malone has a lot of these similar things. Like, he went to Harvard and didn't end up becoming a lawyer. And it seems like one of the things I will give him full props for, he knows a lot about aviation, about airplanes, about how a lot of these communication systems work. Now, I'm sure a lot of it's very dated now, and everything works completely different ways in today. But for the time, this felt accurate to me. I'm no expert, but... Seems like he knows what he's talking about. He came up with like a reasonable way a lot of this could happen, and that itself is a big challenge. And one of the things that I think will set you apart if you're trying to write a book like this is like creating a novel plot that is plausible and complicated and compelling, and actually is something that like if you work in this industry could be worth considering. Right? Because I wonder if people read this and are like, oh shit, maybe we should consider certain, flaws in our security and stuff like that. And like this guy who's writing about it knows what he's talking about. And he's thought about this a lot, and he's been around it a lot. And I think that's some of the best stuff in this book, if I want to give it like some credit.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Like a lot of authors are going to go into stories and try to thread in things that they're interested in because they want to learn more about it, and they want to, it seems that this is someone who knew a lot about aviation and knew how to research these things in the 80s or whenever he wrote it. And then, I'm sure was fascinated with this sort of technology. He knew he was interested in experimental aircraft and brought that into the story as well. So, I think it's cool to see people passionate about different, topics and bringing that into their works.
Yeah. Now, it's not to say you have to be a full-on aviation specialist to be able to write a book like this, but you just have to do a ton of research. And I think a combination of the two is working here.
Well, like I said, like an interest that like is like borderline passion
Right.
will just be enriching to a story like that. It doesn't even have to be about aviation necessarily.
Yeah. Okay, so let me read the first of 2 paragraphs of summary. I think this is the kind of project where a lot of people might listen to this and not read the book. So I want to make sure everybody gets a full picture on what is actually happening in the novel here. So 58 Minutes is the story of a New York City police captain named Frank Malone. Malone works for a terrorism task force, and he's reaching JFK Airport on Christmas Eve to pick up his daughter, who is visiting him for the holidays away from his estranged wife. While he's at the airport, he gets invited to talk to the head of airport security, a man named Benjamin Hamilton, to check out the security of the airport in case of possible terrorist activity. And while doing that, he runs into a woman named Annabelle Green, who Malone was once in a relationship with, and who is now a widow working in the air traffic control room. It's all shaping up to be a boring evening until things start to go wrong, because a terrorist named Willie Straub has accepted a contract from a corrupt Middle Eastern regime to save a man in custody of the FBI. So, Straub devises a plan where a couple of his minions will set up high-powered radio signals that will cause all incoming flights to be unable to confirm their landings. They also cut the power to the landing strip, making it so that no flights can land. They then begin being harassed by Straub, who is just calling himself number 1 and demands that they free 10 different prisoners from the U.S., give them to him, and then fly out of the city. Okay, so that's the setup, right? Like we cut all the power, we disable communications, there's multiple different people at work here going around in different vans, like going to these towers. A couple of like innocent police get caught up in it and killed, get gunned down. There's these like brothers, and it seems like a lot of the organization is headed up by this Straub character who doesn't seem to really care about anything. He's kind of just a mercenary for hire. He doesn't like America, but he doesn't like America just because America is like the big bully on the street, I guess, and so he just wants to like take America down a peg. And then he's willing to use other believers, quote unquote, and other like extremists. He recruit them to his cause, but he doesn't care about their causes. And he's just using them.
I couldn't help but sit there and try to compare to Hans Gruber because it's a diehard project that we're in, and this idea of like a radical terrorist of sorts and
wanting to get prisoners freed, ostensibly.
And there's just like a gravitas and like great villain that Alan Rickman brought to Hans Gruber, and I'm remembering a lot of that, and then I get this character who has some similarities, but ultimately the plan feels a little more half-baked. It's
very complicated. You're relying on this intense weather event to cover a lot of stuff.
A lot of variables are up in the air. They don't feel well planned. And then, like you said, everybody else is just fodder. So all these people are willing to, hold out because they're extremists. And they're saying like, oh, we're going to get back at these Americans, even if it costs me my life. So I think of like the sniper or whatever he was doing.
Yeah.
And
he was one of the most interesting of the villains, I thought. But also like the author so often characterizes people by their nationality. He's Japanese. He's, and so like everything about him is like clearly something this guy has read about Japanese people. And it's like that defines the character, you know what I mean?
And it boils down to stereotypes. Right?
It's all stereotypes. They all fit these neat stereotypes of their nationality and whether they're a man or a woman, and like the way those two things come together, that defines the character. It just feels lazy to me.
Yeah.
It's like not being able to imagine rich interior lives that are unique to individuals. To me, it's a failure of imagination from the author.
Sure, yeah, and like I said, it just feels like paint by numbers in ways. Like it's, you've got these two brothers who are Puerto Rican, and that's their defining thing,
yep.
And
that's their defining thing is the perfect way to put it. It's what they're Puerto Rican and they don't like America.
Yep.
There you go.
And that's really all of these villains. So yeah, I mean, I would have liked some more complexity, some more like. I think some of the most interesting villains that you've seen in storytelling tend to have that wrinkle of, oh, they kind of have a point. Like in some extreme way, they take it too far, obviously. But I think they're the most engaging, and the ones that people remember tend to be those that have like an actual plan that like, you know, you think of a character like, I guess Darth Vader would be a bad example since I already made a Luke Skywalker example. But like so recently, I remember when the original Black Panther came out. Everybody talked about Killmonger as a villain, and how his ideology was that Black people are not treated correctly, and like how that sort of builds up to his making his villain really well realized, and like you're like, well, he kind of has a point, and there's none of that here.
Yeah. So it's so funny you're talking about like that is a thing that we've been seeing cropping up more and more in Marvel, and it's so funny because they do it because they know that is actually interesting, but then you could feel them getting scared and getting worried that people are going to agree with him too much. So what their answer always is to have these characters inexplicably do something heinous.
Sure.
To where you can't quite be behind them. This came up in Falcon and Winter Soldier. This came. I won't get too far into it, but they basically had an organization that was like really like a good group of people who were like had a really legitimate things they were fighting for, and then there's all of a sudden they just blow up like an entire building of people.
In a different story, they're like seen as like the rebellion and that kind of thing, and they're the heroes.
And the main character, who has not shown any of this, all of a sudden just like blows up a building full of innocent people, and is like, well, you gotta break a few eggs, you know. And like it was such an obvious moment of, we're really scared at a certain point you're going to like these people too much, to where when we try and bring back the status quo and celebrate how good status quo is, you're not going to quite be there. And that honestly, like, we're dealing with some similar stuff here in this book of like, that's one of the reasons why you don't do that, because you don't want to break. This is not a book about challenging the status quo. This is a book about the status quo weathering a storm and weathering an attack.
And just to finish up the villain point, like, even if obviously villains are villains, right? Like, I don't agree with them at all, but especially with their means. But even if the ideology is flawed, showing enough of the character to understand how they got to where they are, you know, to say like, oh, this is why they're doing this, and they've been, you know, radicalized by that idea. Whereas this is kind of just like, this guy's mad at America.
I mean, he has a glass eye, carries a grenade with him at all times. He has been responsible for, or at least like tacitly, attached to the death of multiple women that he's like slept with. We hear about at the start, including one who apparently burned alive in a car, and he remembers hearing her like burning alive in the car. This guy is a psychopath, and he's mustache twirling villain. He hates America for just broad reasons. You know, he hates Christianity.
It kind of reminds me of like a poorly written Bond villain or something like that.
Yeah, but without the charisma.
Sure. Yeah.
That, you know, at least Bond villains tend to have. So that's our two, you know, main forces here at work with one another. The opening of the book, I felt like the writing was a little more descriptive. I like some of the descriptions of New York City, seemed to almost characterize it as its own entity within the book, and, you know, looking out at the city and thinking about it as like the city itself is a celebrity, I thought was cool. It doesn't surprise me to learn that the author was, you know, from New York City, clearly loved it.
People from New York tend to love New York, so.
But, you know, like, I thought that was like pretty good writing. It just, I think at a certain point, the author, while writing this thing, like the start of the book, like I don't know if this was his debut, but there was a lot of attention given to the start of the book and hooking the reader with like interesting writing and like actual apt descriptors and some quality, you know, scene work. And you take that, and then I think like as the book progressed, a lot of that fell away, and we got instead into just like a snap, snap, snap. This is what's happening. This is what's happening. This is what's happening. Not a lot of descriptions, just kind of like a plot, just like a plot playing out beat by beat very quickly. And you know, that keeps the pace moving, but it also, to me, it's like, I want a little more meat there. I want something a little more interesting to to read, I guess.
You're talking about the description and the setup and the setting in general. We covered this because it was technically a Christmas film, or at least we're attempting to recognize whether it was a Christmas film or not.
Yeah. She's flying in for Christmas. There's a snowstorm. She's trying to get there for the holidays to spend with her dad. I think these are all hallmarks of a Christmas story.
Yeah, but do you also agree that all of that falls away and has no impact on the story?
It's basically completely unimportant until the very end, when a lot of it comes back. No,
right.
That's totally
Which
true.
I guess is kind of how Die Hard is too, although there's like Christmas parties going on. And
But the thing is, you're in sets that have Christmas decorations often, so it kind of keeps it present because you're visually seeing it. And I assume we'll get some of that in the movie as well. I don't remember, but I think we'll get more of that.
I think that's what the route you would go if you were continuing the Die Hard tradition, right? And had another Christmas story.
It is interesting that this is set around Christmas, and the last Die Hard was set around Christmas, came out after this book, and so when they're looking for it, they found a thriller also set around Christmas, and they're like, yoink, we're going to adapt this thing, change the main character out for someone interesting, and we'll see how it goes. I don't remember the movie being great. I'll be curious to see if I feel differently about it now that I know the source material, if that helps me. So I'll be curious to see it. I assume it's going to be at least an improvement on this.
So would you classify this novel so far as Christmas story?
I mean, no, probably not. I mean, ultimately, it's more of a Christmas story than if it was set in the summer. It's set in Christmas. There's a lot of snow. We hear talks about parties a lot and Christmassy stuff going on occasion, but ultimately the Christmas nature of it is not very important. It comes back around in the very end, I guess. My
reason for it not feeling very much like a Christmas story it might be bullshit, but to me it didn't put me in any more, and I'm starting to feel very festive, starting to get in the Christmas mood, and I didn't feel it I didn't feel it sort of pull me into that at all, and sort of amplify that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes down to what is meant by Christmas movie, Christmas book. What does that mean?
Guess it just didn't get me into the Christmas spirit. So I'm gonna say so far the novel is a miss for me as far as a Christmas story.
Okay, let me read the second half of summary here, and then we can just talk about what the rest of the book. So Malone then works with the staff of the airport, trying to figure out how to save all of the people up in the air, including his daughter. We check in all sorts of people up in the sky, such as a British scholar and his love-struck assistant, a Saudi prince, a nun who is smuggling state secrets to the U.S., a doctor transporting a kidney for emergency surgery, and an old lady being reunited with her family for a publicity stunt. But none of that really matters. What does matter is that Staub has thrown the airport into disarray, and he's gleefully wandering around the airport in a priest costume so that he can keep an eye on the opposition. However, Malone and his crew quickly start getting a hold of the situation. Due to his experience with terrorism, Malone is able to figure out that he's dealing with Staub and calls in some help from the FBI. Meanwhile, some Coast Guard members who have been trying to help finally come across the source of Staub's signal. So Malone, Hamilton, and the Port Authority's SWAT force storm the base, killing the single terrorist inside and taking down the signal. They then use the helicopter to chase down the secondary signal, and Malone kills that terrorist by blasting him repeatedly with a flare gun, causing the truck that contains the signal to crash. So, just like that, the planes can start to land, and Malone returns to the airport to personally kill Staub. He is reunited with his daughter, makes a date with Annabelle, and heads off to enjoy Christmas. And that's the end of the book. So, yeah, he does everything here at the end. Yep. He even smokes a cigar while he's waiting for his daughter to come out of the plane.
He does. And they're like, why don't you go talk to the media? They're going to be so excited you're a hero. And he's like, fuck all of that.
Yeah. That's not why I do this.
I'm not interested in the publicity.
And then he gets offered this golden watch by the crown prince, and he's like, nah, tell him to shove it, basically. And it kind of tacitly threatens him, because it seems like maybe he was connected to what happened in some way.
Well, yeah, and he says as much. He's kind of like, tell this guy not to come on American soil for however long, or else he'll have some problems or something. Which scene, if you were to pick one, stands out to you? Which one are you going to walk away remembering from this novel?
It's funny, because I actually did kind of like some of the stuff that was happening on the planes. In fact, the moment, there's just kind of a moment. It's not really a full scene, but of the midair collision, where the pilot makes this great maneuver to avoid crashing into another plane, and the co-pilot is like, "Damn, that was a great move! Like, well done. He just saved all of us." And then heartbreakingly, a second plane collides with them right then, and like the way it's described is really good.
The co-pilot's like, you know, he only had a moment to be excited about that because then immediately right after slammed into another plane.
Yeah, and it's like tragic, right? Because it's this moment of like expertise by the pilot being able to avoid this other one. Like he makes some sort of great maneuver, and I thought it was really written in a clever way. It's a good like, aviation moment set in this book, you know, that's got so much else going on. So that moment will stick with me. I did like our one, was his name Takashi or something? Like I liked him somewhat, even though he was kind of a stereotype. He was like the most interesting of the stereotypical terrorists, and his sort of standoff with our main characters.
I felt like his was more interesting than the final.
It's more
boss
interesting than
standoff.
a lot of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you?
The scene that's going to stand with me that felt very Die Hard is they're in a helicopter and they're tracking this guy who's on the move in a truck, and he's like a young guy driving the truck, and he's just got a job, and he's like, I'm going to keep my eyes on the road. They get to him, and the way that they find these signals is like, once you pass it, it immediately like flips around and you know you're somewhat near the signal, so they have to get closer. And this guy's got some sort of jamming technology that would be pretty big, so it's filling up this big truck. They get down to the level of the 100 feet or whatever from the truck, and they put the spotlight on him, and the kid, and it's like blinding him from the rear view and the side view and everything. And then he throws that flare in there, and he starts like grabbing it, and he thinks he's gonna be able to get it out, and he's burning and stuff. I just thought that was very John McClane Die Hard of a scene to happen.
There is some flare gun stuff that goes on in the movie, if memory serves, but I just think a lot of these action sequences got taken to like two levels above what we get in this book, because my memory of Die Hard 2 is that the action just gets absolutely bonkers.
Well, the action in the first one is absolutely bonkers.
But it's that escalation problem of like they felt like they had to outdo it, and I think that's been a problem that has made the entire franchise suffer, because with every additional movie they continue to try and do that, and that's why by the time you get to like 4 and beyond, they're just a bunch of superhero. Like John McClane's a full-on superhero, just doing whatever the hell he wants.
I think Live Free or Die Hard is the fourth one, I believe, and I'm pretty sure John McClane takes out a helicopter with a car. Like he like drives a car into a ramp, and it like.
I think he also jumps onto the wings of a fighter jet and like slides across it, and like all this. I can't remember what kinds of crazy shit happened. And you go back to the roots of what makes Die Hard 1 great. Basically, credit to Roderick Thorpe, whose name was misspelled in the credits of the first movie, by the way. I'm sure we touched on that, but I read about that again recently, how they didn't even spell his name right. But like his character, Joe Leland, is flawed. He's this like old man who is out of his depth and just trying his best to survive, and ends up taking out a bunch of people. But like that is so much more interesting to me than Frank Malone. Like when it comes, like I think John McClane beats both of them. But if it's Joe Leland versus Frank Malone, give me Joe Leland every time. Even though there's a lot wrong with that character too, at least he is interesting in a way that to me Frank Malone is not.
Frank Malone is basically a robot.
He's a G.I. Joe.
Yeah, he really is.
And he's also like this is not a term that I will pretend was like on my radar before 2020. But I remember reading a lot about propaganda films and stories that are perpetuating the idea of the like rogue police officer who has to break against like laws that prevent him from using force in certain situations, but we cheer for it because he's clearly a good guy. And he's out there with best intentions, and all these rules and regulations are just holding him back. And when you start to think about how gross that is because of the ideas it perpetuates, you're like, oh, okay, now I see why this is not great for society.
I mean, and historically, we know that films and stories in general do influence culture. Absolutely. And how things are done, and
like I remember having like a fairly visceral reaction to like thinking about this, because I love a lot of cop-driven movies and stories out there. Talk about noir. Like a lot of times it is a cop or a private eye or a former cop or something, and that kind of character who is hard-bitten and has training and is actually out there to like solve crimes and solve mysteries and catch the killer and be a good guy. And there's something just compelling about those characters.
They deal with high society. They deal with the underbelly. They're in different circles, and then they also have to do a really, mentally and emotionally demanding job.
You have to be careful as a creator when you're wanting to write fiction like this about the position of the character and what the effect is on the real world issues being presented, right? So to me, it's like you could still have characters like this, but maybe consider having them not be actual police officers. Give them some situations where they are at odds with law enforcement. Position them as an outsider in some way is my advice, because then I think it's a little more easy to stomach some of the stuff that they have to do for compelling fiction that in real life we don't necessarily want like our law enforcement officers doing.
Yeah. This idea too that the cops have best intentions at all time too. Like that idea that everyone is thinking like, oh, they're like the cops in the movies, like they have our best interests at heart and everything like that.
These movies would have us believe that these cops are all like John McClane. They're all like, was it Murtaugh and Riggs from Lethal Weapon? That you know what I mean? Like these are the cops out there, and that's just not the case. And they're not all good guys who are super popular and all the women want and have no flaws and have our best intentions in mind and just occasionally have to like do stuff that's outside the law, but we should trust them because they know what's up better than us.
Yeah. It's almost like what we were talking about before with characters being messy and flawed and there's gray areas like that's what real life is like. So we should, you should expect that on both the evil and the good side of things and just be prepared for anyone to be capable of anything.
And I'll shout out like a show that is ultimately at its heart a cop story that I absolutely loved, and that was season 1 of True Detective. Mm-hmm. And those cops are deeply flawed, fucked up. They are not good guys at all. The show is kind of an open question, arguably till the end, about like, is it even possible to engage with the darkness that they have to engage with without becoming sort of stained by it? There's a lot of interesting things that can go on, and I do still like stories like this. Like, I just you have to be really careful, especially these days. You have to be careful if you care about what you're perpetuating. Now, if you don't care, then oh well. But like, I care, and I feel like a lot of people do care. And yeah, if you do care, I think then as soon as you decide that you care about this shit, then it is incumbent upon you to make sure that what you're writing is not feeding into that machine.
And I think that's with a lot of different topics, right? Not just here with propaganda.
That's true. That is kind of my ethos as an artist going forward, because I want to write dark stories. I write a lot of violent stories. I write about difficult situations, complicated characters, and I want to engage with that stuff, even as a lot of that bumps up against real world problems and has a lot of like messy areas where there's potential to like feed into it, right? Or lionize the wrong thing or what have you. And so it's just like, I think it can be done. Like, I'm not someone who wants to say like we shouldn't ever write stories for, about X, Y, and Z topics because of this. It's like, you can do it. I just think people got to be careful and be willing to admit that like it's not always going to be perfect and that there probably will be some valid criticism thrown at you for doing it. And that's okay, But I think you'll always feel better at the end of the day if you know that you were thinking about these problems and trying your best to engage with them and maybe lessen the impact. And if someone looks at it and says not good enough, it's still a problem, at least you can feel like, okay, I did try though, and you can sleep at night, versus like either being blindsided or just not caring.
Doing your due diligence and doing it in good faith and kind of thinking about the implications of the things that go on rather than just writing events and saying, this is what I thought of.
Yeah, step outside the story for a minute and think about the message being conveyed. How does this line up with the larger storytelling trends in our society? It's kind of like next level, like advanced thinking about this kind of stuff that I feel like when you're just starting out, maybe you're not ready to engage with. But the further along you get in your creative journey, I think the more you want to start making sure that you're engaging with this, because as soon as you start to publish, whether it's fiction or you start making movies or anything like that, as soon as you start making something with your name attached to it, you are now in the fair game for this kind of stuff, right? Whether it's not just the criticism, but like you are making something that has effects on people
and can be critically assessed,
right? And that's a responsibility that we should all take seriously, and figure out where we're at and where we feel comfortable, I guess. So anyway, just kind of a rant. It's like this book doesn't have like a ton to really sink my teeth into here at the end. Like it's just a big action-y set piece after set piece. 58 minutes is how long the plane has before it's going to crash, by the way. I did read, and we'll get into this next week, but I did read that there's like a shout out to this where in the movie somebody asks the pilot how long they have before they're going to crash, and he says 58 minutes, and people are like, oh, it's a little shout out to the book, and so that's cool to see. But yeah, I don't have a lot else to say about this book. It's just like it wasn't. I don't know. I didn't love Nothing Lasts Forever. Don't get me wrong. And I was reading through some reviews of this book, and a lot of people were saying it's better. And I get why you would say that, because like there is some very capable writing early on. Some of the characterizations, while broad and stereotypical, are decent and somewhat compelling. There's a lot of different kinds of characters here. And then the aviation stuff, the technical details are all interesting if you're into that kind of stuff. So I can see why the general consensus is maybe that this book is better than Nothing Lasts Forever. I don't know if I'm ready to go there because of how much I care about the main character and how much I think Joe Leland, even though deeply flawed character that I didn't love fully, I still think is more interesting than this like white bread, boring ass protagonist we got here.
Yeah, the white main character.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think it's funny to refer to white people as the white.
Yeah, a white.
Yeah,
by a white who runs this book.
Yeah.
Do you remember enough about Nothing Lasts Forever to like draw back on and like how do you? Because I know we both didn't love that book, but like.
Yeah, I don't think that I do. I don't think I remember enough about it. I think this also something about this feels pre 9/11 more interesting because we didn't live through it in a similar kind of way to like pandemic stories feel more interesting before COVID and the lockdown.
Right. Everything's too real now. a lot of this stuff is too real.
Yeah. It feels too real in ways. And then also like, you're like, oh, would it actually happen this way?
Well, because of course 9/11 is actual hijackers, right? And religious extremists. And a lot of this shit is very fraught to think about now in a way that it just wasn't, at the time.
Like I said, I think that maybe if we're talking pre 9/11, what I think is more interesting of a story, this idea of the possibility of something like that happening is really interesting to think about.
I want to ask you this. Someone says like, oh, I heard that the Die Hard movies are based on books. And you said, yeah, there's 2 of them. And they said, oh, which one should I read?
Gut feeling, I feel like I preferred the first one because I remember like...
There's some real racist stuff that happens in that one too. I remember that.
Oh, I'm not saying, ideologically that I agree with it.
Yeah.
I just think that I remembered enough about it. I remember enough about it to know that it was like pretty similar to the film in certain ways. There's still like a Nakatomi kind of plaza.
Yeah, I think a lot of the bones of what makes Die Hard the franchise it is, there's more of that DNA in Nothing Lasts Forever than there is here. To me, this feels like they borrowed this book for its plot. But I don't think anything about this book made a major change to John McClane as a character. Whereas I think John McClane was created as an alternative to Joe Leland, a younger, more capable, more charismatic alternative. And I think he was kind of created in conversation with that character from the book, you know what I mean? In a way where it's like John McClane is just plopped into this plot for the second movie. So in that case, like if you're someone who wants to read a Die Hard novel, I think I'm going to recommend the one that's harder to find. I think I'm going to recommend Nothing Lasts Forever just because it's going to give you more insight into the franchise and into the character. Not saying I necessarily endorse it or think it's a great book, but I think it's more interesting to the Die Hard fan who wants to know more.
I agree. That's sort of where I was leading with all of that. And I think that when I really think of this story now that we've finished it and we're kind of wrapping up here, there's a lot of plane stuff going on. I guess technically he gets in a helicopter at times, but some of it feels like a lot of like disjointed pieces that come together to sort of like defeat this villain. Whereas like something about a tower and everything being all self-contained and the villain sort of being there and the protagonist sort of getting up to the top and defeating him.
Oh, if it comes down to what's the better story between Die Hard 1 and Die Hard 2. I think it's going to be no contest.
Well, what I mean is like the structure of the story is like the location and like everything.
It's brilliant. That's what makes Die Hard 1 so good. Like one of several things, but like part of it is how it is this like self-contained, like the scope of it is very digestible. This gets so far-reaching and out of control at times that it's hard to orient yourself, and it feels larger than life, and in a way that the very human and contained story from Die Hard 1 does not.
And I guess what I'm trying to say is like my imagination of what a story with planes and like the sort of Die Hard-esque nature of a story and all the possibilities of what could have happened. My imagination of this was like bigger and had more of an impact that it didn't really deliver on.
Yeah. One thing I do remember from the movie, and this is something we can touch back on, is that I felt like John McClane got caught up in this story in a way that was like very accidental, and then he is just like, he is John McClane. He's got insight, he's got like gut reaction, and he's kind of a badass. I mean, he's definitely a badass, but like he like accidentally gets caught up in all of this and ends up having to do cool shit, whereas Frank Malone from the beginning was choosing to be a part of this, was inserting himself in the investigation, so was inserting himself in every situation, and when he did, everyone respected him and listened to him. And he had very little pushback from anybody. It was a lot of just like him coming in and owning the space and owning what's happening. So I think that's one of the major things I want to pay attention to is just how different the character of John McClane, who's being overlooked by people, who is not in a position of authority, how he is affecting this plot in a way that Frank Malone in the book engaged with in a very different way. And that's something I think we can pay attention to going into next week for our Christmas project on Die Hard 2. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any other ones that allow you to leave reviews, it'd be great. And we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, and YouTube as well is another big place that we would appreciate. Comments or anything else you can leave.
Leave a like on the video.
Connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film.
And if you'd like to support this podcast in another way, we have a Patreon where we just released an episode about the Cabinet of Curiosities, the 3 episodes of that show that we didn't cover on the main feed. It's like episode 1, 7, and 8. And we had a lot of fun talking about that. They included some of the best offerings of Cabinet of Curiosities. So definitely check that out. That's over on patreon.com/inktofilm, and you can get access to all of our bonus content for $2.
I think we've gone a little bit over 58 minutes at this point.
Yeah, we'll see. Maybe in the edit you can get it. If you can get it down to 58 minutes, man, that would be awesome.
Yeah, right.
We'll see. You'll take a look at the time, and you'll see whether or not we were successful. But yeah, it just should be fun to come back next week and talk about. Looking forward to it. Hope everyone's having a good holiday out there. And until next time,
keep adapting.